Elena Reed's Charleston apartment smelled of reheated coffee and old paper. The walls were a mosaic of her obsession: topographical maps of the Glenville region, hard-won architectural plans of the sanatorium, and black-and-white photographs of a man with kind eyes and an impeccable mustache, Dr. Marcus Reed. On a central table, under the glare of a work lamp, rested the main artifact, his leather-bound journal. The professional camera on a tripod blinked a small red light. Elena, sitting before it, had the air of an academic about to defend an impossible thesis. "For those just tuning in," she said, her voice calm and articulate for the lens, "my name is Elena Reed, and for my entire life my family has carried a shadow. The shadow of my great-grandfather." She gestured to the photo on the wall. "Official history calls him a monster. The 1980s press dubbed him the maestro of Glenville's madness. My grandmother, his daughter, died refusing to speak his name. My father tells me some things are best left buried." She paused, picking up the journal. "But I've read his words. Words of a man who believed he was on the threshold of a new era of mental medicine. A man who sought silence, not suffering. I don't believe history has told the whole truth. That's why I'm going to Glenville. Not as a ghost hunter, but as a historian, as his granddaughter. I will find the truth and clear his name." She turned off the camera. For a moment, the silence in the apartment felt heavy, the weight of a conviction she alone carried. The drive into the West Virginia backcountry was a gradual descent into another time. 4-lane highways gave way to state roads, which in turn became ribbons of cracked asphalt, hugged by a dense, indifferent forest. Civilization receded with every mile. The cell signal was the first to die, followed by the radio, which dissolved into a ghostly hiss. With the tank nearly empty, Elena pulled into what felt like the last gas station in the world. It was a decrepit place, with a single rusty gas pump and a small, grimy windowed store. A thin old man in faded overalls and eyes the color of an overcast sky watched her from a rocking chair on the porch. "Fill her up?" he asked, his voice a gravelly drawl. "Yes, please. And maybe a coffee, if you have it." As the gasoline trickled slowly into the tank, the old man jutted his chin toward the map on Elena's passenger seat, where Glenville was circled in red. "Going a long way, missy." "For work," Elena replied, evasively. The man narrowed his eyes. "Ain't no work up there. Hasn't been for over 40 years. Just the old hospital, and the things that got left behind." Elena's heart quickened a little. "Things?" The old man spat onto the dusty ground. "My daddy worked construction on that new wing, back in the 50s. The silence wing, they called it. He said that Dr. Reed was a strange man, obsessed with sounds no one else could hear." He leaned in a bit, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Daddy said the silence they made up there was wrong, too heavy, so heavy that on quiet nights you could hear the sounds from inside, leaking out. Not screams, worse, whispers." Elena felt a shiver. "Local legends, I imagine?" "Maybe so," the old man shrugged, straightening up. "But my daddy never slept right again after working there, and nobody from this town goes up that hill after dark. Some things ain't legends, they're warnings." Paying for the gas, the man's words echoed in her mind. She cataloged them as folklore, the kind of stories that flourish in isolated places. Yet, for the first time, a seed of real unease was planted, a dissonant note in her mission of certainty. The gate of the Glenville Sanatorium was just as it looked in the photos, but no picture could capture the aura of sovereign decay the place exuded. The old Jeep looked like a toy before the imposing, gloomy structure. The building didn't just seem abandoned, it seemed to be watching, a leviathan of brick and slate slumbering in a sea of wild greenery. Elena decided to explore the grounds first. The air was cool and smelled of damp earth and decaying leaves. She found the remains of a garden, where stone angel statues were cloaked in moss, their faces eroded into expressions of perpetual grief. Further on, a children's playground. The rusted metal swings creaked softly in the breeze, a lonely, desolate sound. They moved in an almost synchronized rhythm, as if ghostly children were pushing them in an eternal game. Elena approached, the EMF meter in her hand remaining inert. "It's just the wind," she told herself, but she couldn't shake the mental image. She found the solarium, a long glass and iron structure where tuberculosis patients once took sunbaths. Now it was just a skeleton, most of its glass panes shattered. Shards of glass hung from the frames like teeth, and the floor was carpeted in a layer of leaves and slivers. It was a greenhouse for sick memories. After nearly an hour of circling the property, documenting everything with her camera, she finally stood before the main entrance. The massive double oak doors were ajar, a dark invitation. Taking a deep breath, she pushed one open. The groaning sound of the wood was the first noise the building itself had made, the moan of a giant being roused. The entrance hall was a masterpiece of decay. Sunlight, filtered through a grime-covered skylight, fell like a divine spotlight onto the cracked marble floor. A majestic staircase swept up into the darkness of the upper floors. At the reception desk, an avalanche of papers and patient files covered the desk and the floor. Elena knelt, picking up one of the files. The paper was brittle, almost crumbling in her hands. Patient. Clara M., admitted, 1958. Diagnosis: melancholia with severe dissociation. Elena felt a pang of sadness. Clara M., a real person, a life undone. What had become of her? She spent the next hour exploring the ground floor, the dining hall, with tables and chairs overturned as if by a sudden act of violence, the chapel, where the pews were covered in a layer of dust so thick it looked like dirty snow, yet the stone altar was eerily clean. In each room she used her equipment, spoke into the void, but the sanatorium remained silent. It was a place heavy with history, but seemingly devoid of spirits. Her theory seemed to be holding up. It was just an abandoned hospital, a victim of time and exaggerated stories. Then she found it. At the end of a dark hallway on the first floor, there was a set of double doors, different from the others, made of metal with a padded lining on the inside. Above them, tarnished brass letters formed the words she had been looking for since she arrived. AP Wing Auditory Palliative Therapy, the Whispering Wing. The air in front of the doors felt colder, denser. The silence that emanated from behind them was of a different quality, deeper and more active than the silence of the rest of the building. It was an absence, a vacuum. Elena raised her camera, her heart beating a little harder against her ribs. "Okay," she whispered, her voice sounding loud and intrusive. "This is it. The place where it all happened. Let's see what secrets you're keeping." She pushed on the metal doors, which swung open with a long, hissing sigh, like steel lungs exhaling a breath held for 40 years. She stepped inside into the silence that awaited her. The air inside the auditory palliative therapy wing was different. It was heavy, dense, as if the very absence of sound had mass and weight. Elena felt it press on her eardrums. A silence so profound it became white noise in her mind. Every sound she herself made, the rustle of her jacket, her own breathing, the dull thud of her heart, was an explosion in a dead soundscape. It was like being wrapped in black velvet, suffocating and infinite. The doors to the patient cells lined the hallway, silent steel sentinels. They were identical, save for the small numbered plaques. Driven by an impulse, she went to cell 204, the number from Clara M.'s file. The door was ajar. With a metallic groan, she pushed it open. The room was a concrete box. Bare, cold, functionally cruel. There was only a metal bed frame bolted to the floor, and, in the center of the floor, a drain. But it was the opposite wall that caught her attention. On it, scratched into the plaster with what could only be desperate fingernails, was text. Fragments of sentences. Overlapping, frantic. And in the center, a statement carved with a legible fury. "I am not a vessel." Elena ran her fingers over the grooves, a shiver running up her arm. Vessel. A strange clinical word. What kind of therapy would lead someone to scratch such a denial into the wall? The smell of desperation in the room was as palpable as the cold. She backed out into the hallway, the silence now seeming less empty and more expectant. Whatever happened here, it wasn't therapeutic. It was a violation. At the end of the hall, a reinforced steel door stood out. A small brass plaque, green with tarnish, read, "Control and Observation Room." Elena's heart hammered. The brain behind the operation. The lock was broken, the door slightly ajar. She stepped inside. The place was a graveyard of technology, a library of agony. Hundreds, perhaps thousands of audio tape boxes lined shelves from floor to ceiling. In the center, reel-to-reel tape recorders and dusty control panels looked like the altars of a forgotten religion. She felt compelled to begin. The first tape she played contained only static, a deep, empty hiss. The second, a recording of a patient murmuring about the man who sings inside the walls. Interesting, but not conclusive. Her skepticism, despite the warning scratched on the wall, was still fighting for dominance. Then, she saw it. On a separate shelf, almost like a trophy, was a box labeled Patient 204, Clara M., Final Session. Her hands trembled as she loaded the large reel onto the machine. With a heavy click, the tapes began to turn. First, the static, then the choir, a sea of interwoven whispers, rising and falling in sickening cadences. It was the sound of an entire asylum contained on a single magnetic tape. Elena leaned in, mesmerized by the horror of it. Then, individual voices emerged from the cacophony, like castaways in an ocean of pain. A woman. It's not silence. It's an ocean, and it's drowning us. A man. He put it in us. The worm in his brain. Elena felt her blood run cold. Worm in his brain. Vessel. The pieces began to connect in a monstrous way. And then, it happened. The anomaly that broke her reality. A voice, one she instantly recognized from her own recorder, spoke with impossible clarity. Her own voice. Elena. She tore the headphones off as if they were burning. Panic, pure and absolute, seized her. She stumbled backward, the air knocked out of her lungs. How? How could her name, her voice be on a recording made 30 years before she ever set foot here? Logic unraveled. The laws of physics and time seemed to bend and break in that dusty room. For a moment, she thought of fleeing, running to the car, driving away from this cursed mountain and never looking back. But the investigator in her, the obsessed granddaughter, was stronger than the fear. This was no longer about clearing her great-grandfather's name. It was about exposing whatever this incomprehensible horror was. "No," she said to the camera, her voice trembling but with a new, dangerous resolve. "I'm not going anywhere. This changes everything. I need to document. I need proof." Night fell over Glenville like a shroud. Elena turned the control room into her base, a fragile encampment of light in an ocean of darkness. She set up night vision cameras in the hallways and left audio recorders at strategic points. She would spend the night. She would confront whatever lived here. The first few hours were silent. The only sound was the hum of her equipment and her own racing heart. She began to think that perhaps the phenomenon was contained within the tapes. Then, at around 3:33 a.m., it began, a faint whisper coming from down the hall, indistinct. Elena froze, listening. The whisper came again, a little closer, and again. It seemed to be moving toward her. She watched the monitor for the hallway camera. There was nothing, just the empty green-tinted corridor. But the sound was undeniable, and it was getting clearer. Na, her name, drawn out as if spoken by a throat full of sand. She grabbed her crowbar, the cold metal and inadequate comfort. The voice was now just outside the control room door. "We see you, little Reed, hiding, with the memories." Then, the nature of the attack changed. It became personal. "You never should have come here. You disgrace our family, chasing the ghosts of a bad man." Elena gasped. Those were the exact words her father had said to her on the phone before she left. No one else had heard them. The terror was no longer about a haunted place. It was about an intelligence that could rifle through her mind, that could pluck out her most intimate fears and throw them back in her face. She shrank to the floor, pressing her hands against her ears, but it was useless. The whispers were no longer just outside. With a horrifying clarity, she realized that some of them were already inside. System resumes transmission. The air in the control room is thin. The night deepens. Elena's sanity frays, replaced by something older and hungry. The transcript continues. Horror reports. The Glenville Sanatorium. Director's Cut. Part 3. The Gospel of the Monster. The psychic attack ceased as abruptly as it began. The ensuing silence was, somehow, worse. It was no longer an empty silence, but a watchful one. The silence of a predator that has stopped toying with its prey and now just observes, waiting. Elena was huddled on the floor of the control room, the echo of her father's words still ringing in her mind. The terror was so intense, it had become a physical thing, an ice in her veins. She knew she couldn't stay there, paralyzed by fear. Fleeing was impossible. The door seemed like a tombstone slab, and the night outside was a domain that did not belong to her. There was only one path forward, inward, into the one artifact that held the answers. With trembling hands, she picked up her great-grandfather's journal again. If she was going to die here, she would die knowing. She opened it to a later section, where Marcus Reed's penmanship had lost all its elegance, becoming a series of sharp, obsessive strokes. March 17, 1965, she read in a low voice. They continue to use the word patient. Such a limited term. They are not patients. They are containers, vessels. I look at them and see the beauty of the void, the purity of an unmade mind, ready to be filled. And the substance I possess, my sickness, is not a poison. It is divine. It is the sound of the universe itself unraveling. And I am its prophet. I am not breaking them. I am completing them. The moment the word vessel left her lips, a new sound began. It wasn't whispers. It was a dull, rhythmic thudding. Slow, steady. It came from the walls, from the hallway outside. 1, 2, 3. Like a colossal, anemic heart. There were dozens of thuds, out of sync, yet forming a collective pulse. Elena had the nauseating image of fists, of hundreds of long-dead patients' fists, beating weakly from the other side of the padded walls, responding to the reading of their profane gospel. Ignoring the cold sweat beating on her forehead, she turned a few more pages, the script becoming even more chaotic. November 9th, 1972. The symphony is almost complete. Each of them now holds a fragment of me. Together they form a collective consciousness, a hive mind of my own making. I am the conductor, and this wing is my concert hall. The machines, the tapes, the wires, they are merely my baton, tools to direct the energy, to tune the instruments. But the music, the true music, it resides in them. It is self-sustaining now, an echo that, once created, can never be undone. With the reading of this passage, the rhythmic thudding in the walls stopped. The silence that followed was broken by a new sound coming from within the control room itself. A click. Elena looked up. One of the large reel-to-reel machines had activated on its own. The tapes began to spin, slowly and silently. Then another, and another. Within seconds, all the machines in the room were operating in a ghostly silence, their reels turning in unison, playing an unheard song. The dim lights on the panels blinked, the VU meters quivered, reacting to a sound that existed on a frequency her ears could not register. A subtle scent filled the air, pipe tobacco and cheap brandy, the smell of her great-grandfather's study. She felt a sharp drop in temperature, and in the dark reflection of an oscilloscope screen, for a fraction of a second, she saw the silhouette of a tall man standing behind her. She whirled around with a cry. No one was there. He was here. Not as a ghost, but as a presence, a consciousness imbued in the very fabric of the place, conducting his orchestra of machines and echoes. The hours dragged on. The night was a torture of subtle, maddening phenomena. Flickering lights, equipment turning on and off, the scent of tobacco coming and going, and the constant, unbearable feeling of being watched by eyes that no longer existed. Elena clung to the journal like a castaway to a piece of driftwood. It was her poison, and her only antidote. Near dawn, exhausted, her eyes burning from lack of sleep and from crying, she reached the final page. There was a single entry, written with a terrifying clarity, as if at the end, Marcus's madness had solidified into a perfect, monstrous philosophy. June 12th, 1985. They have forced me to close the doors. Fools. They think they can imprison an echo. What I have created here is more than a reservoir. It is a legacy, a sentient consciousness that, like any organism, will seek to survive. In time, the original vessels will decay. The energy will need a new conductor, a stronger vessel, with a natural affinity for its frequency. Blood calls to blood. One day, one of my own will come, not by accident, but by design. They will come seeking answers, and they will find their purpose. They will not destroy my symphony. They will become its new conductor. This is not a curse. It is my immortality. The journal slipped from Elena's hands. The air left her lungs in a single, devastating sob of understanding. It wasn't random. It wasn't about the patients. It wasn't about a haunted place. It was about her, her search for the truth, her obsession with clearing his name. It was all part of the design. She wasn't an investigator discovering a story. She was an heir arriving to claim a cursed inheritance. She had walked into the trap that had been set for her before she was even born. At that moment, the first, faint ray of morning sun pierced through a crack in the control room's grimy window. With the arrival of the light, all activity ceased. The machines stopped. The cold dissipated. The smell of tobacco vanished. The sanatorium went back to sleep, its night's work done. But Elena was no longer the same. The terror of the previous night had burned through her, calcifying fear, grief, and doubt. What remained was not a frightened woman. It was something hard, cold, and bright like obsidian. It was a pure, atomic rage. She slowly stood up and picked up her camera. She looked into the lens, and the person who stared back was not the same one who had arrived here the day before. Her eyes held the darkness of the night she had just survived. "He didn't want to be forgotten," she said, her voice devoid of any tremor, each word a shard of ice. "I will make sure he is erased. This place, this music, doesn't need a new conductor. It needs silence. True, final silence. I will burn every echo, every tape, every wire. I will silence this symphony forever." The first morning light that seeped into the control room brought with it no warmth or hope. It was a cold, gray light that served only to illuminate the extent of the ruin and the solitary figure of Elena at its center. The night had emptied her of fear. Her great-grandfather's gospel had filled her with a frigid purpose. She was no longer an investigator. She was an exorcist, and her ritual was about to begin. Her movements were deliberate, devoid of panic. There was a frightening calm to her actions, the calm of a surgeon about to amputate a gangrenous limb. She took the camera and positioned it at an angle that captured the entire room. Log 07. Date. Irrelevant, she said, her voice an icy monotone. Eradication protocol initiated. She didn't start with the machines. She started with the tapes, the library. One by one, she took them from the shelves, not with anger, but with a ritualistic contempt. She opened the plastic cases, and instead of smashing them, she pulled out the long, thin, magnetic ribbons, unspooling them across the floor. Within minutes, the control room floor was covered in a nest of brown and black snakes, the recorded echoes of hundreds of unmade minds, now exposed and vulnerable. "This is for Clara M.," she whispered as she pulled a tape. "This for patient 73. And this for all the others whose names were erased." With the floor covered, she turned to the machines, the conductor's batons. With the crowbar in hand, she began her work of deconstruction. It was not a blind fury, but a series of precise, devastating strikes. She smashed the reed heads, shattered the motors, tore out the wires as if they were veins. Each blow was an act of negation against her great-grandfather's philosophy. Each spark, a syllable in her response to the legacy he wanted to bestow upon her. The sanatorium remained silent, as if holding its breath, watching her dismantle its heart. Finally, only the main console remained, the terminal from which Dr. Reed's voice seemed to have emanated most strongly. Elena stood before it. "You said an echo can never be undone," she spoke to the empty room. "Echoes need walls to bounce off of. I'm going to tear down the walls." She raised the crowbar over her head. "Your symphony is over." The final blow was delivered with the full weight of her pain and rage. The metal pierced the console, which emitted a sharp, dying electronic groan before falling silent forever. And with it, everything fell silent. The silence that followed was different from all the others. It was not pressurized, not expectant. It was a vacuum silence. The silence of true, absolute nullity. Elena stood there, her chest heaving, sweat pouring down her grimy face. She looked at the destruction around her, a graveyard of technology and echoes. She had won. The relief was a wave that hit her with physical force, making her knees buckle. She smiled, a genuine, exhausted smile. It was over. It was then that the vacuum demanded to be filled. The sensation began as a sudden migraine, a spike of ice in the center of her brain. She brought her hands to her head, a moan escaping her lips. The pressure increased exponentially. She looked around, confused. She had destroyed the source. Why hadn't it stopped? And her great-grandfather's words, read hours before, returned to her mind with the clarity of a death sentence. "The machines, the tapes, are merely my baton. The energy will need a new conductor. Blood calls to blood." Her mistake was catastrophic. She hadn't destroyed the energy. She had only broken its cage. And the energy, free and unfocused, now turned to the only compatible vessel in the room, the conductor for which it had been designed for decades. A voice, no longer coming from a speaker, but exploding from within her own consciousness, spoke with cruel amusement. "Ah, my dear granddaughter, thank you for freeing us. The orchestra was so tired of its old instruments. Welcome, maestro. The podium is yours." The dam broke. If the previous night had been a flood, this was a psychic tsunami. Hundreds of lifetimes of pain didn't just whisper, but screamed inside her. The agony of Glenville poured into her soul. It wasn't just sounds or images. It was a transfusion of existence. She felt the terror of being strapped to the chair. She tasted the metallic tang of electricity on her tongue during an electroshock session. She felt the cold of a phantom lobotomy scalpel. She saw the faces of her own parents morph into the distorted faces of sadistic nurses. A precious childhood memory, her father teaching her to ride a bike in a sunny park, was invaded. The park became the Glenville lawn, the trees became the barred windows, and her father's smiling face became the mask of clinical indifference of Marcus Reed. Her mind, her identity, herself, was being unraveled, thread by thread, and rewoven into something new and monstrous. The first-person singular began to dissolve into a first-person plural. "I feel pain. We feel pain. I remember. We remember." She fell to the floor, writhing amidst the wreckage of her useless victory. Her body was the final battleground, and she was losing. The last thing her singular consciousness registered was her own reflection in a shard of glass, and the eyes that stared back at her, filled with a multitude of ghosts. Then, her consciousness merged with theirs, and Elena Reed, the investigator, ceased to exist. 6 months later, The YouTube channel Read Investigations posted a new video, the first in over half a year. The title was simple, Episode 1, The Silent Orphanage of St. Jude. The production was flawless. The woman on screen was Elena. She was in a brightly lit hotel room speaking calmly to the camera. She was professional, articulate, even radiant. But her eyes were abysses. There was a calmness in them that was not peace, but the silence of a graveyard after a snowfall. "Hello, everyone," she said, a soft smile on her lips. "I know I've been away. The investigation in Glenville was transformative. I found what I was looking for, and so much more. I discovered that so many places like Glenville hold the voices of forgotten people, trapped in silence. My mission, the mission of this channel, has changed. It's no longer about proving or disproving. It's about listening, about giving a voice to the forgotten." Behind her, on a whiteboard, a list of locations: St. Jude's Orphanage, Eastern State Penitentiary, Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum, the Amityville Horror House. Over the next few months, she continued, her graveyard eyes shining with a profane zeal, we will be visiting these and other locations, not to hunt ghosts, but to expand the collection, to ensure that no story, no pain, no echo is ever lost. Her smile widened. "Join me as we give a voice to the silence." She reached out and the screen cut to the channel's logo. She said she was going to help. "It's so crowded in here. Please get me out."